Hello and welcome to Champ Select, the one and only competitive Legends of Runeterra podcast. Joining me are my usual co-host Noble.
Hello.
And Hugh.
Hello.
And we got a fun episode for you today. We're going to be going over the region identities and just general combat effectiveness. And things
types
that you
of interaction.
should know. The things that you should know just playing the game, so you know what you need to and what you need not play around. And then we're probably going to go into our usual metagame breakdown. We've all been playing a lot of ladder this last week.
So much ladder.
And I think we're also going to go over the recent European Masters tournament that's still going on at the time that we're recording this. We're recording this, I think that it's probably live literally right now. With the final day of competition. So we aren't sure who's going to win yet, but we've at least got like a top four.
We have
pretty good meta snapshot that we can talk about. So pretty excited about that.
Cool.
We want to, without further ado, get into some region identity stuff. I'll let Noble take it away.
Yeah, so for these, I kind of want to break down the 8 regions that are currently in the game. This idea kind of like popped into my head a couple times a couple days ago when I was playing a game, and my opponent's regions were something like Bilgewater.
It's probably Bilgewater Noxus.
Bilgewater Noxus, and I was like, oh, this trade's always, we were debating a block and whether or not they were going to trade, and I said this trade's always going to happen because none of those regions have tricks that pump toughness, which means that the 2 units are always going to, trade, which kill one another. So we're going to kind of break down each region, kind of what that region identity is, the things that you can expect from it thematically, and then also the kind of instant speed and burst, so fast speed and burst speed spells my Magic player bled through a little bit there. Let's go ahead and start with the most recent region, Targon. Targon
Probably
kind of
one of the most played ones too.
Yeah.
It just has so many really good early spells, and mostly in the 2-mana slot with Pale Cascade. Which has been seeing a lot of play and a lot of stuff.
People are splashing Targon in their mono region decks just to play Pale Cascade.
And it's been really good, too.
Yeah, the card is so good.
Yeah.
So that's a 2-mana burst spell that gives a unit +2/+1 and then has Nightfall. So if you've played another card this round, it draws a card. So it's basically like what we would call that free, in that it doesn't take a card out of your hand because it replaces itself, and then can make your units your 1/1 trade up into their 3/3. It can also make your 3/3 win a trade against their 3/3.
I found that the most common application for that card is actually just saving a card from damage-based removal spells.
Oh, yeah.
I've saved a lot of Mistwraiths with Pale Cascade when they're getting Mystic Shotted.
Yeah, stuff like that.
And stuff like that.
Or like TF red card with a barrel.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff like that. And honestly, just the +2/+1 is so good because it usually, especially in those circumstances, it actually also is like a permanent heal one.
Yeah.
So it not only occasionally keeps your thing alive, but sometimes it also heals one so it's out of range for burn spells on the next turn too.
Yeah, because
it replaces itself, and it's only 2 mana. It's just like the card just feels so good to play. It's basically never dead.
Speaking of cards that replace themselves, we're going to talk about kind of like the holy trinity of Targon interaction, and they're all 2-mana burst spells. The other ones being Sunblessed Vigor, which just gives a unit a permanent +0/+2, which is a little more niche in use than Pale Cascade.
It's the worst one.
Yeah,
of the three for
it's
sure.
less universal.
Well, it doesn't draw a card. That's why.
And the other one is Guiding Touch, which heals your Nexus or a unit 2, which does draw a card. Yeah, the best text in the card game, in any card game. Yeah. And so Sunblessed Vigor sees a little less play than the other ones. Well, a lot less play than the other ones. And then Guiding Touch sees a lot of plays in synergy decks like Lee Sin Zed and Tom Soraka.
Yeah, you're not just going to splash Guiding Touch for no reason, like you will with Pale Cascade, because Pale Cascade is just a good aggressive card.
And a good mid-range card. And a pretty good control card.
Yeah, but it is just absolutely great in any deck that is either trying to play a slightly longer game or trying to do any type of synergy.
Yeah, like once again, it's free. It saves your things from damage-based removal sometimes.
It's one of the other important things. It just saves you against aggro like a weird amount of the time. Like that little 2 extra health.
The margins are so thin in this game.
That Targon has against aggro decks, I think, is in its healing between Guiding Touch. There's been a lot of star shaping floating around lately with the invoke
Is that
control
the
decks.
5-drop that heals 5?
Heals 5 and invokes.
Yeah,
a card
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
costs 7 or more.
Yeah. So one thing that we're getting at here is that Targon as a region has healing as one of its major identity. These are like healers, the sections of the units and champions in Targon are like, there's like healers like Soraka, Star Shepherd, and other units that buff healing.
Starspring.
Yeah,
is the
Starspring,
landmark, obviously.
the landmark, and then Nightfall with Diana, Pale Cascade, and then Leona, Daybreak
And
stuff,
Invoke.
and Invoke in Aurelion Soul. So those are kind of like the 4 sections of the region, kind of as I think of them. And many Legend of Runeterra is actually designed this way. There are like batches of cards that have similar arts. So for example, like you can tell, well, in other regions that aren't Targon, the most released one, each new champion comes with a batch of like other followers and spells, and they usually have a thematic theme in their art, and we'll talk about that when we get to some of the other ones. But they kind of tie it together so that when you're scrolling through, you can see, oh, these all of the humans with animal companions like have synergy together, and that's mostly true, which is a really cool thing about how this game's designed.
Yeah, so basically what this boils down to is when you're playing against Targon, you should probably expect them to be healing. The most important application that I have found, that I had to learn the hard way a couple of times before I stopped doing it, is when you're playing against Targon, be it Expedition, be it Constructed, hell, if it's a Singleton Gauntlet, whatever it is, if you're going to kill a unit with damage in combat and a burn spell, this happens quite a bit in... this just happens a lot, you know, if you're going to block with a creature and Mystic Shot, you know, a Soraka or whatever. Let's say that we're going to put a 4/4
in front of their
chump
Soraka.
lump in front of a Soraka and Mystic Shot it. You need to Mystic Shot it during combat, not after the chump lump deals damage, so that you cannot heal it out of the Mystic Shot, because the way the stack works, right, like once you hit okay, it's all going to resolve, so your opponent won't get a chance to heal in between the 2 damage and the 4 damage.
You want them to not have a point where their unit is damaged.
Yeah, you want it to go from full to 0 as quickly
0
as
to
possible.
100. Yeah, for
essentially.
Sure.
So like that's the most applicable thing I've found against Targon, and it actually has, I think, won me quite a few games just by sequencing. And I've lost a couple games to it originally, learned my lesson, and then have been winning more games. And I've even noticed that, like, oh, my opponent just like guiding touch their Nexus. If you know they had that last turn, I would probably got blown out if I did it in another way. So
Yeah, for sure.
it's pretty good.
So the other thing Targon has going on, it has a pretty wide spread of units as far as unit size, because it both has dragons, some like pretty mid-rangey size like Nightfall and Daybreak followers, and like the smaller little like dorky support heal things. Oh, that's the other archetype, is support.
Yeah,
'Cause there's kind of
support.
one for each
There
champion.
are a lot of healing,
There's
a lot of
Lulu
buffing.
and Taric are both. So
Lulu is Ionia.
oh yeah, Taric
Taric,
is the yeah. I don't know why she just feels very Targon, but it's because she came out at the same time.
Yeah, they came out at the same time, and she has support, and she synergizes very well.
They're quote-unquote removal spells, so things that interact with your opponent's units are basically only Hush, which is a 2-mana burst spell. Why didn't I put this in the holy trinity of
that one's
burst spells?
real good.
There's-
Yeah.
They have so many cheap burst spells, which is part of what makes decks like Lee Sin like so good with Targon, and like Heimerdinger and Vi. All these spell-based champions work really well with this region. So Hush is 2 mana and says silence a unit until the end of turn,
Yes.
until the end of the round.
Yeah.
End of the round.
My magic lingo is just gonna
Really,
seep in here.
really good at dealing with Ezreal.
Yeah.
It just annihilates Ezreal.
So
They
silence
attack with it
removes
and
everything.
Silence it. And
And then they're just
attack
attacking you with a dumb
it.
1/3. You just get to eat it.
And they never have any real way to like, and they don't. The Ezreal decks never have pump spells or anything. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
it's
no,
either
that's just not what the regions
it's either
do.
they're gonna like try and point a bunch of burn spells at your guy in response to try and save it, in which case you probably got your value anyway, or you're just gonna eat their Ezreal and it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also is very good against many other champions,
Yeah,
like Vi, because it makes her a 2/4 without tough, or like Fiora, because it'll like remove the barrier.
Remove the barrier and
of the like that she gets from the attacking Shen, and then like even if she still kills your unit,
It doesn't.
She doesn't flip.
it doesn't count towards her level up. So like Tryndamere, it'll make him die permanently.
Yep.
Anivia will die permanently and not make an egg. Like, it is the fact that this is the only silence spell in the game that silences champions for a reason it is very, very powerful.
Yeah,
Now, if
Silencing
only-
Champions.
The
is
card has
just
been nerfed
so
and
strong.
changed many times.
Now, if only
Like 3 times.
killing Anivia and making an egg meant that we didn't have to deal with any more Anivias.
Yeah. Yeah, the Rekindler still does get that one back, but we'll talk about that when we get to Shadow Isles. So basically, little removal. Their combat tricks look like Pale Cascade, Sunblessed Vigor, Guiding Touch.
Very little things that affect power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically
Bastion,
only Pale
notably,
Cascade.
is a 4-mana burst spell that gives a permanent spell shield and a permanent +1/+1, which can kind of counter one of your removal spells that targets their units, and with the spell shield, and also gives a permanent +1/+1, which I sometimes forget.
Card is fine. It's worth remembering if you can, but I don't think it's seeing very much.
Yeah, it's
constructed
only
play,
really
or
played-
arena or expedition.
Yeah,
play, excuse me.
It's really played in
anymore,
specific decks like the Lee Sin deck.
Mostly
or
the
like,
Lee Sin deck.
I've even seen that deck cutting it recently.
I went down to 1.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen 1 or 0 as the most common.
Notably, it's burst,
I've
which is
basically
really
stopped
important
playing around
against burst spells like Hush from your opponent, because then you can play your protection spell, and then it has the spell shield. Then they need 2 things to be able to interact with it.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that came up when you were playing the Lee Zed deck was like you attack, and if you wait for them to move first, they just get to Hush it, and now you have a 3/5. But if you would have played your burst spell first, they can't respond to it. It gets its power, it gets spell shielded, and then they need something to remove the spell shield and the Hush or whatever.
Yeah.
And so like little removal from Targon, most of their buffs are like keeping their units alive with a couple ways to get power. Mostly Pale Cascade. Play around this card.
Pale Cascade's the only way.
I've
to
been
get
playing
power,
so
and
much Fiora Shen, and
You need to play around Pale Cascade.
Yeah.
it's so annoying.
You cannot just try and make a block after your opponent casts a spell. Like,
It punishes you so hard.
If your opponent gets a full card worth of value out of the Pale Cascade, you probably lose the game on the spot.
Because it replaces itself.
Yeah,
It's what is
disgusting.
known as a 2-for-1. They are getting their
the cleanest 2-for-1 in the books.
yeah, or a 1-for-0, right? It replaces yourself, so it didn't even use a card from their hand effectively, and then it also gets a card worth of value by eating your creature.
And sometimes it gets a tempo advantage too, because it'll like eat a 2 or 3 mana card instead. So.
Cool. So that's Targon. Now we're moving on to Bilgewater, the other region that was released recently. Bilgewater is the pirates. It's kind of like sea monsters, pirates, a little bit of like spell synergy with Fizz, but that is not really supported in the region as of
Yeah,
yet.
not well. Certainly not well.
just gonna go with not playable.
Its keywords are what? Deep and what are its other keywords?
Plunder.
And
Plunder.
it makes kegs, which buff the damage of a spell, which is really interesting because I was looking through and it just only has 1 damage spell, and it's Make It Rain. Except there's like Double Up, which is the 6-mana one, and Scrap Shot, which is the 7-mana one. But those see very little play.
There's also Parlay.
Oh, and Parlay.
Parlay
Okay.
is pretty relevant.
That
There's
makes sense.
a few not so good cards that can randomly get buffed by powder kegs. But
Warning
really,
Shot.
Really, it mostly finds its powder keg application from other regions.
Yeah, and like Twisted Fate Red card is another big one.
Yeah.
So the things that you should play around in Bilgewater, they have very few combat tricks, and I would say if you're playing competitively, you don't have to play around the card Pocket Aces. So you can just assume that Bilgewater does not contribute a thing that
Buffs
does
a creature.
buff
no
creatures.
combat tricks
Yeah.
from Bilgewater,
So
basically.
Pocket Aces is a permanent +2/+1, and it's 3 mana or 2 if you've drawn it that turn, and it's burst. It comes up very rarely because it's not played and constructed very much.
Yeah.
Maybe think
It's
about
not
it
even
in
that
limited.
good in Expedition.
Most of the way they're interacting with the board in a combat situation is by casting Noxian Fervor or Death's Hand, just damage or Make It Rain.
These are Noxus, yeah.
And all of those cards are not.
Yeah,
are
I
not
know.
Noxian Fervor,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So most of their removal is they have 2 types of removal. They have those damage-based removal, like we called like Double Up, which is a 6-mana spell that does 2 damage up front.
It's awful.
Yeah, Make It Rain, which is a 3-mana that spreads out 1. Parlay, which deals 1 damage. So maybe watch
And
out
is
for 1
slow.
toughness. Yeah, and is slow. So maybe watch out for 1 toughness units. But other than that, your like 5/5 is not going to get removed unless your opponent has Scrap Shot, which is expensive, doesn't see, and is maybe relevant and limited, but sees very little.
I think if you're playing Scrap Shot and Constructed, you are a crazy person.
Yeah.
It's just vengeance, man, and it tosses for my sea monsters.
Sick.
Yeah.
So then the basic primary way that Bilgewater has to remove units is giving things vulnerable, and it has multiple ways to do that. It has a burst spell that deals a damage to 2 of your units and makes 2 units vulnerable, and then there's one that that
There's one that's
Hired gun.
1 mana slow, makes a thing vulnerable if it dies
Be
that
warned.
round. Yeah, exactly. If it dies that round, then you draw a card, but it has to die that round.
I think the most constructive playable one is Hired Gun by
Yeah.
quite a bit.
which gives the strongest. It's a 2/3 for 2.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that a lot of the time when Bilgewater decks pass on turn 2, a lot of the time they're just waiting for you to play a thing, and then they'll like Hired Gun it, especially if they have the attack token
Yeah,
on turn
and
2.
then
So
they can
consider just, passing back to you on turn 3 to not get quite as blown out if, instead of playing like a 2/2 or whatever and then just getting it eaten.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode
on attack token priority.
attack token
yeah.
and like when you should not play a 2-drop versus
because
2.
sometimes you can't afford to not play a
when you should
2-drop.
pass without attacking because they like can't play a thing because your unit has challenger, like et cetera, et
when you
cetera.
should open attack.
Yeah.
I think my summary for Bilgewater is play around Hired Gun. Yeah. And I think that's kind of the only thing that you need to worry about.
Yeah. The card that I was thinking of is Shakedown, which is deal 2 to an ally to get 2 enemies vulnerable, and it's a 1-mana burst spell.
Which is
Gets
only
played
in Tom Raka. Yeah, exactly.
which
Because
is
they can.
Tom Kenshin Soraka.
They've been playing a lot more of that card.
The card's very good when you
it's picked
can
up.
reliably heal all your units.
Yeah, I ran
and
into a deck where they cast that 3 times against me. They cast all 3 Crusty Codgers, all 3 Shakedowns, and all 3 Star Shepherds, and my aggro deck got annihilated.
Yeah, that'll get you. And then the last thing that is worth noting that just when I was looking through the cards, just now I remembered exists is Devourer of the Depths, which is a sea monster that is technically a removal spell because it's a 4/4 with deep, so it gets +3/+3 if you have 15 or less cards in your deck. That says when you play it, you choose one of their units and it's obliterate that unit if it has less health.
Yep.
Then it does.
And that is the backbone of deep.
Yeah, it's
like
really
the
good
deep
in
deck.
the deep deck. It's a huge bomb in limited.
Yeah.
But you're not going to see it outside of anything other than the deep deck. And to be honest, I never play around anything in the deep deck anyway because you just need to kill them. So
Yeah,
they have,
exactly.
they have it.
The most the most relevant trick about that card is if you hit it with damaged based removal, it checks its current health. So for example, if they play it trying to kill your 1/3 Ezreal and you Mystic Shot it,
It'll go to a 4/2
it'll
and
become
Ezreal
a
will
4
live.
with it'll have 2 health now and then Ezreal will live, which is basically the how is all of the play surrounding that card. So that's Bilgewater. Now we'll move on to some of the classic regions that have been in the game since beta. We'll start with the pretty upfront and honorable one, Demacia. So Demacia is basically all about playing
all honor until they kill you with Fiora.
big units, winning combats. So they have well-costed units up and down the curve. They have some pretty beefy, like for example, 5 and 6 drops.
Yeah. Toughness is one of their.
Yeah.
They have a lot of tough creatures.
Yeah. Like the mechanic tough,
Yeah.
which is that they reduce incoming damage by 1, which makes them very annoying to
5/5
kill, especially when so much of the ways to kill units in this game is trading multiple units into a larger unit using damage-based removal spells, stuff like that.
Exactly.
A 5/5 with tough is just like 5 toughness with tough is just absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Really hard to kill, yeah.
Yeah. So they have a ton of combat tricks up and down the curve. The most relevant one and the newest, so the one I forget to play around the most is anyone want to try?
Concerted strike.
No, Sharp Shot or Sharp
Sight.
Sharp Sight. That's what it is.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I wrote down Sharp Sight. I wrote it down right. And it's a 2-mana burst spell that gives a unit +2/+2 and
Can block elusive.
yeah, so this is another killer of many in Ezreal that makes your random 2/2 be able to eat their Ezreal. It's burst speed, so it doesn't really get interrupted by damage-based removal. It's just so efficient for its cost. Just 2 power and 2 toughness for 2 mana burst speed with an additional effect is just very, very solid. It's really great on Fiora. It's really great in the Scouts deck.
It's really great in all the decks it goes in. It's just a good. I
card.
grossly underestimated this card. I looked at it and I was like, 2 mana
Me
for
too.
+2/+2. Like that's.
I was just like, oh, moving on. And I think that was like kind of a Magic player brain thing, right? Because combat
Yeah.
tricks aren't very good in that game. And I don't want to talk too much about this is not a Magic podcast, but that's a thing in Legends of Runeterra is these combat tricks are very good. They win you games.
I did
Yeah.
the exact same. Another card that impressed me a lot was Ranger's Resolve.
Oh my god.
That card,
My
I
God.
read that card and I was like, this card is awful, horribly unplayable. And then I played it,
and then it
my
wipes
opponent-
your board.
Yeah, my opponent put it on the stack one time, and I got Plague Winded for 1 mana. I was like, never mind.
Yeah.
I was wrong. Like,
Yeah.
this
It
card's
gives
great.
all of their units tough this round, which makes trading so hard, especially when they have scout and they're getting like a ton of value out of it. Like their scout attacks, you're like, cool, I'll make some trades, and then they survive that, then they get to attack again. It just gets so good.
Yeah, and then like
And it's
you
just so cheap.
You line up like, oh, these blocks are perfect. I'm going to trade 3 of my creatures for 3 of his creatures. 1 creature of mine's going to eat 1 of his. They just slam a 1 mana combat trick
That
and
affects their whole board.
Affects their whole board, and
you
your
just get
entire
wiped.
board
It's
just gets
ridiculous.
eaten
Yeah.
by their suddenly much tougher
Yeah, I've been
creatures.
toying with putting this card in Fiora Shen, which we will talk about at the back half of this podcast. We'll talk
Interesting.
about some
I like
decks.
that.
Yeah, I know,
Seems
right?
pretty good. Yeah. And then we can't really talk about Demacia without talking about barriers.
Yeah.
Barrier is probably the most important keyword that
to
Demacia has in probably both
In combat.
constructed and limited in combat.
Yeah.
As far as
True,
combat
true
tricks
to the
go.
true to the summoner spell in League of Legends. It just absorbs basically the next source of damage. So it says the next time it's taken damage. The way you play around this is if you attack a 4/4 into their 4/4, they give it barrier, and then you can cast a fast spell that deals like 1 damage to the
Yeah,
unit.
Vile Feast is usually the
most common culprit.
Yep,
Yeah.
Vile Feast, and now the
Speaking
2
of
mana.
Vile Feast, well, boy, are we getting to Shadow Isle soon, and I'm excited.
Yeah.
So then another thing to know about Demacia is they have very little removal, and all of their removal flows through their units in some way, whether that's they have challengers that can choose and make your units block them, or there are things like Concerted Strike, Single Combat, and Detain, all of which require you to have a unit. Single Combat being the most efficient at 2 mana fast, making them
the thing.
fight. Detain having one of your units capture one of their units, which means it's
really
gone
good
until
in
it dies.
It's really good in Expedition. Detain is, I think.
Yeah, it's like-
I haven't seen it in constructed in quite a while.
Yeah, it's one of
but I
the-
think we might see a return soonish.
Yeah, it's one of the only like quote unquote hard removal spells in the game. It's one of the things that bypasses toughness in every way, and just will get if you have a 20/20
Essentially kill
Detain,
spell.
get it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like Vengeance.
Yeah. And then the most important thing to know about Concerted Strike, it's a 5 mana and it picks 2 of your allies to strike an enemy. They strike one after another. So against something like Barrier, it counts as 2 instances of damage. So if you have a 2/2 and a 4/4, and they have a Barrier Fiora, you can Concerted Strike the 2/2, and as long as you click the 2/2 first, the 2/2 will strike, get rid of the barrier, and then the 4/4 will strike. This is important to know when you have on-strike abilities and when you have stuff like Fury, so you want to line it up so that, for example, your River Shaker strikes first, draws you a spell, and then your Screeching Dragon
Or
gets to finish it
Fiora.
off. And or
It's
Fiora.
the trigger.
Yep.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. That's Demacia?
I think
I
so.
mean, yeah, basically Demacia is just
pretty
efficient,
straightforward. It's
efficient
just
creatures, lots of combat tricks. They can't really remove your guys without having guys of their own.
Yeah. Good, fair, upfront, Legends of Runeterra.
Yeah.
I like it. What's next?
And then they play Fiora. Okay. Which is, and then next up, we're going to go with Freljord. So Freljord, something that is important to know is they have very few ways to pump the power of their creatures. The notable exceptions being Fury of the North, which is a 4-mana burst that gives +3/+4 until the end of turn, but doesn't see a ton of constructed play, but definitely worth playing around in limited. And Battle Fury, which is the 8-mana permanent +8/+4 at burst speed.
It adds a Tryndamere to the board.
Yeah, most notably, those are both champion
spells.
spells for Sejuani and
Tryndamere.
Tryndamere, respectively, which is worth knowing because that's basically the only time you'll see them in constructed as extra copies of those cards. And boy, do they blow you out if your opponent thinks to themselves, "There's nothing in their deck that pumps power," and then they have a Sejuani
Yeah,
out.
when you think to yourself like they don't play this card, just be careful about that. You always have to remember a champ spell because Sejuani decks will very frequently just have another Sejuani in their hand, so you do have to play around a card.
Yeah,
that's
also
not
comes up
necessarily
in
there.
Freljord with Trundle's Icequake being an actual board wipe, but they have Avalanche too, so
I don't know. I can't say
the
I've-
card's awful. Yeah, Trundle's Icequake
really
is not
bad.
good.
Yeah, I've never really been blown out by that card. I can count on one hand the times I've been blown out by
I've seen it
Icequake.
be good, but it's pretty rare.
So this region is defined by things that keep your units alive. Frostbites, which set the power of your opponent's units to 0. They're all burst, except there's a slow spell that gives frostbite and vulnerable.
Caught
in the cold.
Caught in the cold. Yeah.
So there's a 1 mana 1 that frostbites units with 3 or less health. There's the 3 mana
just frostbite,
Frost-
single target
yeah,
frostbite.
single bite, frostbite something, and then there's Harsh Winds, which is 6 mana burst and does 2 of them. They're all very evenly curved. It's like frostbiting a unit is worth 3 mana. When you do 2 of them, it's 6 mana. When it's a small unit, it's 1 mana. That's what the frostbites do.
Yeah.
And then there's also toughness pumps, and the most important of these being Troll Chant. -2 power to one of your opponent's units and +2 toughness to one of yours. This swings many a combat. It's not as huge a blowout as like Pale Cascade can be because it's never going to make their 3 power creature kill your 4 power creature, but it is going to make multiple trades not be trades.
I don't know that it's not necessarily less of a blowout. It's different. Like it's
I've gotten blown out by that.
By the way
way
the
harder
card
than
functions,
Pale
because it buffs one of yours and weakens one of theirs. It is a built-in 2-for-1 if you can set it up properly.
It also like beats their combat trick in that, like, if I'm attacking and I'm like, this is a fine attack, my Fiora into your 2/3 or whatever. Yeah. They play that, and there's just like very few things that you can play. Like
it's a 1/3 attacking a 2/5.
Yeah, like there's like there are very few tricks that you can have on your side that like make that good now.
Yeah.
It's also really good at removing Spell Shield because it's just kind of like a free burst that also removes and that also pumps one of your units. Other things to note in... Oh, did you have something to say, Hugh?
No, okay. You're good.
Other things to note in Freljord is basically they have no hard removal and their only damage-based removal is Avalanche, which is a 4 mana slow spell that deals 2 to all units. This is really important to know when you're playing aggro decks against Freljord decks in Constructed.
Yep. Absolutely, and most expedition decks in Freljord usually have a copy as well.
Yeah,
so
it just kind of
yeah, happens. It just kind of comes up. It's in a lot of the seeded packs for Freljord.
Yeah, I think that the game tries to give you an avalanche when you play Freljord. At least that's my experience. Obviously, that's pretty anecdotal.
Yeah, and we can talk a whole time. That. We'll have a whole episode about seeded packs and all that. But
I have noticed that if you want an avalanche in your Freljord deck, you're usually going to get one. So
yeah, absolutely.
Play around it.
So what are we going to say? Frostbite, big creatures.
Yeah, and then those champ spells.
The champ spells are really the
one thing we should note about Freljord as just a region. A lot of hand buff, a lot of buffing your units in your deck.
Yeah,
that's the last thing that should probably be mentioned.
Like Omen Hawk, Avaros and
Hearthguard.
Yeah, and Avaros and what's the Allegiance one called? Like Riders, Avaros and Riders.
Tusk Rider.
Outrider.
Avaros and Outrider is the 3/3 for 4.
The Tusk Raider is the ultimate set. It's the one that it's Sejuani's like ship.
Yeah.
And it has Plunder, so if you've hit their Nexus
for damage in any form turn.
Have you ever just not conceded to that card on the spot?
Sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Are you kidding?
But usually it draws a 10-12 Sejuani, which is like pretty hard.
Usually by the time my opponent triggers Plunder on the Tusk Raider, I'm so dead that I just like concede on the spot.
Yeah,
at least that's always been my experience. I'm sure it's very beatable, but like every time my opponent has plundered a Tusk Raider,
any deck that has reach, any deck that has direct burn damage, you can totally beat it. But if you're trying to hit their face with creatures,
you're trying to play
screwed.
good, fair, go hard Magic, you're done.
Yeah, it's over.
Demacia, get out of here. Yeah, that's the death knell. Really important thing, another mechanic that Freljord actually shares with Bilgewater that we kind of forgot to talk about is Plunder. And it just is a way of explaining things that your opponent might do. Sometimes it's worth making a trade that you wouldn't otherwise make so that your opponent hasn't dealt damage to your Nexus, so they can't trigger their Plunder cards.
Denying some damage to your Nexus some turns for an unfavorable trade is sometimes totally backbreaking. You
can also just like make them use a warning shot or whatever that they wanted to like level their Gangplank on a non-attack turn, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I've found that when Sejuani or Gangplank flip, they're actually like 2 of the hardest cards to beat in the game. So I actually think that you really want to prioritize not taking damage against those 2 champions if you can.
Sejuani locks you out.
They have the level up condition of having damage to the opponent's Nexus in 5 separate rounds.
Yep.
And which will make them play interesting.
Yeah, and it is very hard to beat those cards, especially if you're trying to play creature-based attacking decks. If they flip, you're basically dead.
Yeah. All right. Next up is Ionia. There's so much to talk about here because it's a region whose identity is really based on spells and like tricky followers with effects.
Yeah.
Very few like quote unquote vanilla followers that don't have very
I don't think
much
we're going to be
text.
able to go over everything with Ionia.
No.
Other
Yeah.
than you should know that if you're playing against Ionia, you should expect everything. The only hard limit is that they do not kill creatures.
Yeah, they don't do damage directly to creatures, and they don't say like kill a unit. It's the things to look out for are they have some stuns to like concussive palm to like stall, and then
Steel
they also
Tempest.
have
Will of Ionia. is
Will of Ionia
probably the
and
most relevant.
Whimsy only on followers, but it does both silence the follower and make it a 1/1.
Yeah.
So very easy to kill with a unit
Close
in
to
combat.
a kill spell.
Yeah, but only on followers. As a region, they have a lot of spell-based champions like Karma. They also have Elusive.
Yeah, Elusive
And a bunch of pump
was
spells to go
back.
with it.
It's less of a mark of Ionia now than
Just got
it
nerfed so many
was.
times.
Yeah, because it was so powerful.
It was
Like,
so powerful for the longest time. Like Elusive is just such a powerful keyword.
I
and-
legitimately think Greenglade Duo is the only elusive card that exists from beta in its original form. Like all of the other ones
I think you're right.
at least like playable low cost ones.
That
Navori-
and Wafer Hatchling
Navori Quickblade.
Conscriptor. Or
The 1-mana 2/1.
Navora Blade
Oh.
Scout. Navori Blade Scout.
That's,
Yeah.
That's the
that
one.
one's unchanged, I think.
Yeah, I remember looking at the nerfed deck that was still good, by the way, and being like, oh, my Curve of Inspiring Mentor into this unit is now a full either +1/+1 or +0/+2 worse than it used to be, and it was still good.
Yeah.
And it got nerfs even after that.
I mean, I think the reason the deck is now not great is because of just the sheer volume of deal 1 damage to the board.
Yeah, like
things.
Noxus getting a bunch of removal that was actually good against it, and
TF existing.
yeah, like
Feel-
stuff like what's it called? Go Hard, which we're going to talk about because
Make It Rain existing. Like, that's
So
it.
Ionia, lots of tricks, and also really notably, the only things that can actually counter spells in this game.
Yes.
Nopify, 2 mana, counter a fast or slow spell that costs 3 or less, and Deny, counter a fast spell, fast, slow,
Or
or
skill.
skill. It's a little confusing if you're coming into this game what things Deny is going to counter and what things Spell Shield is going to stop at the outset. Basically, anything that puts one of those little circular tokens up onto the stack. So burst spells can't be countered by either of. Oh, so burst spells do still get blocked by Spell Shield, but as far as
There aren't
things
very
that
many
followers
that
do,
target your opponent's cards
yeah.
in general.
As far as things that, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
I agree. All right, good. So yeah, if you're playing against Ionia, there's a lot of stuff they can do. Lots of tricks. Basically, expect that they can do anything for the most part. If you're familiar with
They have some
constructed,
things that
you'll
give
probably
quick attack on attack, but their tricks aren't great defensively. They don't have any tricks that pump toughness, as far
They
as I
have
know.
twin disciplines.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah,
That
they have
doesn't-
everything
they have
because they have twin
Yeah,
disciplines.
they're just a toolbox region.
If
They
you-
have
yeah, in-
a little bit of everything.
In Expedition, I think you can play around. It's hard to play around everything, and you should just pick the most likely ones and the best ones, which is mostly twin disciplines. In Constructed, if you're playing against an Ionia deck, I really recommend just taking a quick look up at a normal list so that you know what you need to be playing against.
All right, people, we've gone through the bread and butter combat trick ones. It's time to talk about the regions that do some damage. I kind of accidentally put all 3 of them at the end. We'll start off with Piltover and Song. We're leaving Shadow Isles for last.
Okay, sure.
Because I anticipate it taking a little while. So Piltover and Zon is defined by a lot of damage-based removal. It has Thermogenic Beam, it has Mystic Shot, it has Get Excited, it has Gotcha, it has Static Shock.
All cards
Yes.
that deal damage.
Deal damage to units. The highest number is 3 except for Thermogenic Beam, which is slow, so you know that your 4/4 is probably going to connect when you attack it outside of multiple spells. As far as tricks, Suit Up, being setting a unit permanently to 4/4 is pretty powerful and can get you.
I think that's it as far as buffing units that they do, right?
There's really
Rising Spell Force
not
is, I
much.
believe.
No one plays that.
Yeah, no one plays that one, and Vault Breaker also no one plays, but
It is Vi's spell, so
It is Vi's, yeah.
it will get. You'll see
You'll
it.
see it occasionally.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a
have-
a couple combat tricks in Piltover and Zon, but it really mostly is the damage-based removal spells. So you should mostly be expecting your creatures to get spells pointed at, which is relevant. It makes certain attacks not good that could be good. It makes certain combat tricks much better than they normally are. Like I talked about Pale Cascade specifically.
Or the ones that pump toughness, like
Sunblast
Troll
Vigor, Troll Chant, all those things get really good.
And then also the region is kind of defined by having small followers just in general. These are like the ones that care about spells, the like kind of low to the ground aggressive ones, stuff like that.
Something else to note is that one other the synergy that this whole region, it has a theme of poison puff caps, Teemos, shuffling.
We don't need to talk about that.
I mean,
I know.
you gotta
mostly
mention it.
joking.
I think
It's,
far more importantly is the discard. Sub-theme
that's fair.
Has been central to like the discard aggro decks and Jinx.
And Ezreal Draven to some extent.
Ezreal Draven does a little bit of it too. The discard things almost always pair with Noxus because that's the other region that has that type of stuff. But expect that sometimes if your opponent is discarding things in Piltover and Zon, that they're going to be able to get good things off it.
Like
Zon
put a
Urchin,
jury
get
rig
excited.
or
Jury rig is in
can put
Piltover
free units
Zon.
and put units in play at burst speed, which is something that very few regions can do.
Yeah.
The only other one being a Shadow Isles, which makes a Mythrace. But that's a great segue, Alex, into Noxus. Noxus has damage-based removal, like Noxian Fervor, which deals 3 to one of your units and 3 to theirs, which importantly...
Or their Nexus.
Or their Nexus, which importantly you can cancel by killing the unit of theirs that they're doing 3 damage to. It also has Death's Hand, which deals 2 to one of their units and 1 to their Nexus.
Lots of spells that pump power.
Lots of spells
Yeah.
upon power, Elixir of Wrath, Might, Brothers Bond, Vision are all things that do that. And then there's Culling Strike, which kills a small unit. It kills a unit with 3 or less power. And the Reckoning, kind of following that theme, which says if you have a 5+ power unit, kill all units with 4 or less power.
Yeah.
Very powerful. We'll talk about what decks, like there is a constructed deck that card is in. We'll talk about that later. And then the last little section of interaction and stuff that you should know about are things that kill damaged units. Yeah. So Ravenous Flock is 1 mana and deals 4 damage to a stunned or damaged unit. That card
is really good.
Is really
4
powerful.
damage for 1 mana is such a good rate. It gets played a lot.
Surprisingly not that hard to set up. You'll see some...
It always has a
Arachnoid Sentry.
Arachnoid Sentry is the
units,
most frequent offender.
Jumping with House Spider.
Yeah, exactly. It's...
Yeah, and then there's like Noxian Guillotine, which is probably the most relevant one to think about occasionally. Quite a few decks play 1 or 2 copies in Constructed. You'll usually see 1 or multiple in Expedition because they're just generally good. Yeah. So if you can, try to keep your units at full HP against Noxus.
And then Noxian Guillotine in particular makes copies of itself, so it can kill multiple damage units for 3 damage a pop.
So you need to...
Backbreaking.
It's frequently better to trade off a damaged unit than to try and trade off an undamaged unit or save an undamaged unit, potentially with a better ability.
Your 2/4 with 2 damage on it is worse than your 2/2 if you have no way to heal it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And then what's the last one is the one that kills a damaged unit or a landmark.
Scorched Earth.
Yeah, that card is not seeing very much play anymore.
It kills landmarks against Tom Raka.
It kills Star Spring.
Even against Tom Raka, I find myself pointing it at Tom Kench or Soraka far more often.
And then
Star
getting
Spring.
blown out by all those spells that we were just talking about that heal your units. Mostly astral projection.
Yeah, I mean, you can't like I said, you can't just blindly point it at a damaged unit, but I do find myself pointing it at the champions more than the landmark in that matchup for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And because of that, I just took it out of my deck.
And put it in
basically, and
Noxian
everything
Guillotine.
to play
Yep,
it.
same.
All right.
That's where I was
All right. We saved the best for last. We have approximately 20 minutes left for our podcast. We'll see if we use it all in Shadow Isles, though I do want to talk about the meta a little bit. So Shadow Isles is the region for killing things. It makes this the region that most control decks and mid-range decks play in this game. It has very few combat tricks, except Mark of the Isles, which grants the unit that you're pumping ephemeral, so it's going to die anyway. So it's good for getting in a little bit of damage, maybe having your unit trade up. Very good on unblocked units, very good in response to like damage-based removal in combat if you don't block the unit, to have that survive to deal like 6 damage or whatever, which can be pretty good and is worth looking out for. The other trick that I would look out for is Glimpse. The
Glimpse Beyond.
Glimpse Beyond, yep.
Okay. I was like, Glimpse the Unthinkable? That's
No,
not
that's
right.
not.
That's not it.
But Glimpse Beyond kills one of your units and draws 2 cards, which is very good in response to your opponent's spells, is very good when you're chumping like a 1/1 on a 5/5. It's very good against like the card Fiora. I've been running into it a lot while I'm playing this Fiora Shen deck.
I would love to make a real quick PSA about Glimpse Beyond. I've seen people try to cut copies of Glimpse Beyond in their aggro deck. Stop. Quit doing that. Play 3. Always.
Yeah, play 3.
And additionally, it's actually, I think, really quite good to kill the unit that they are Glimpse Beyonding in response. I actually think that people don't do it nearly enough. And I think that you should really consider like pointing a Mystic Shot at a thing that's going to die to
because
a
it becomes a
Beyond or whatever.
2-for-1, right? Like they are trying to Glimpse Beyond their 2/2, and then if you kill it with a Mystic Shot, your Mystic Shot was worth their 2/2 and their Glimpse.
Yeah, another thing to note is that a lot of people try and just play out their Glimpse Beyond proactively. You usually don't want to do that. Like,
yeah, I'm
wanna
not a fan of just like
slamming it down.
Of like mana efficient, just like Glimpse Beyond my 1/1 or whatever. I usually don't prefer doing that. I think that Glimpse Beyond is like pretty much the single reason why the aggro decks in this game feel like they have such longevity. Like there are a lot of games where when you're playing the aggro deck, you know,
Mistwraith, yeah,
Mistwraith, or just like against Piltover and Zon, where it feels like they occasionally need to point 2 spells at some of your creatures, and sometimes they point a spell at a creature and you glimpse it,
and it's
like
such a blowout.
you end up with like 3 more cards than them in the end game, and sometimes you're still going to lose to Commander Ledros or Karina or the Ruination or something where they
a lot
get
of
all
those
their
cards are
back.
Shadow Isles.
Yeah, where they get all their cards back, but like very frequently on turn 8, when you're playing a Shadow Isles deck against a Shadow Isles aggro deck against a control deck, you'll have more cards in your
It also
because of Glimpse
denies Asbriel triggers, it denies Swain damage, and it denies Fiora ticks for killing units. So it's very good at having play to make sure their champions don't level up sometimes.
Beyond. Yeah, you can like block a River Shaper and sack the thing. It's just so good.
Yeah, it really is.
So then this also has the only things that actually straight up kill units in the game so far: Vengeance at 7 mana fast and Ruination at 9 mana slow, which is very clunky, but it does kill all units and very worth playing around.
Yeah, no, that's one of the biggest play around cards for the region in general.
Yeah.
In the game.
Yeah, no,
Full stop.
yes.
Yeah.
You're right.
Really, like, a big part about this game is knowing my opponent is not Ionia. They cannot counter my spells. My opponent is not Shadow Isles. They cannot kill all my units. That means I can continue committing things to the board.
And if you're like an aggro deck, it's very, very important to know that, okay, they have 9 mana or they do not have 9 mana. There's a
For
very
example,
specific line
if
of
they
play.
have the attack token this turn and they tap below 9, you can play all your creatures and
Exactly.
then open attack on the next turn before they have a chance to cast the Ruination. Another thing that Shadow Isle has is a ton of drain spells. Withering Wail deals 1 to your whole board and gains them 3 life. God, that card is so good.
It is so good.
Vile Feast, very marquee card. Drain 1, make a 1/1 Spiderling. If the target is removed before the drain happens, they both don't gain the 1 point.
And don't get the spider.
And then there's Unspeakable Horror, which is a drain 1 Nightfall, create a Nightfall unit in your hand. If that target is removed, they still do get the Nightfall unit in their hand. They also have Grasp of the Undying, which is a drain 3. Which is a drain 3 for 5 mana fast. So they have tons of ways to heal your Nexus too, because all of these drains deal damage and then heal them back. They also all get pumped by Kegs and Funsmiths, which also pumps the healing, which is a big part of several decks. And then I think the marquee card of Shadow Isles right now is
Go hard. For sure, go hard.
Yeah,
1
definitely go
mana
hard.
drain, shuffle 2 more in, and then once you've played 3 of them, it flips and is pack your bags, 5 damage to the whole board and the Nexus.
And the Nexus.
For 1 mana.
Which is honestly
Absurd.
a really good time to begin to jump into the next section of our podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Go hard is a pretty key part of the meta in Constructed right now.
I'm not sure exactly, but there are a lot of decks based around Go Hard right now. I'm not sure how many there are.
There's quite a few. And I guess it's not actually that many in number, but it is a very high percentage play rate.
Or at least there's a lot of
And the
variations of there's like 2 or 3 decks, but there's a lot of ways to build those decks, and there's a lot
And the
of
decks that do are very prevalent. They're seeing a lot of play. Like I think the most popular deck right now plays Go Hard.
Yeah, I think the most popular deck is the
So,
Twisted Fate Go Hard.
Yeah.
Twisted Fate.
So
And
I
Shadow
can
Isles
give a
Control, basically.
quick breakdown of the meta as I see
Yeah,
it at this
yeah, go
point,
for
just
it.
kind of a list of decks. This is kind of compiled from my experience on the ladder. I've played hundreds of ladders games over the past week. And gained and lost very few LP. Maybe this is maybe Diamond 3 is where I belong, but I hope not. I've also been switching decks a lot. And a really important thing to think about when you're climbing is staying with the same deck so that you learn it really well, learn its matchups. It makes you win the hard matchups more often, and it makes you much less likely to lose the easy matchups because you're much less likely to make mistakes. So kind of this meta snapshot is from that, and it's also from this European Masters tournament that we've been talking about, which has a very interesting format. I don't think we need to talk about it as a tournament format.
Yeah, go ahead, just fire us off the meta snapshot.
Yeah.
We can go through it and pick out the ones that we want to talk about.
Yeah,
exactly.
So as far as aggro decks go, this is kind of structured as aggro mid-range control rather than like what I think the best decks are, because there's so many decks and they're all pretty playable. So for aggro, we have the Pirates deck, which is MF Gangplank and also plays Noxus. There's the discard aggro deck, which is Draven Ezreal. There's
Jinx, usually.
Draven Jinx. There's also a Draven Ezreal deck. Yeah. There's the Mistwraiths deck, which usually plays Elise and Callista.
Correct.
And splashes, that's the deck that we were talking about, the splashes Pale Cascade. So it plays Targon as a region because it's kind of like free because all of their other cards are Shadow Isles.
It's free until you myths on Wraithcaller and you lose the game. Not that that's ever happened to me before.
Then there's the MF Quinn or MF Lucian, so Misfortune Quinn or Misfortune Lucian Scouts deck. That's kind of where aggro's at right now. Then there's also mid-range decks, so decks that kind of have a good amount of removal, play to them, look to kind of like grind
decks, fair
out.
costed creatures, fair costed removal, looking to curve out.
Yeah, mostly my criteria for things aggro versus mid-range in this game is how much interaction they play, because like if your deck is just has mostly units, I'm going to classify you as an aggro deck even if your units go up to like 6 mana or 6 or whatever. So for mid-range, we have Fiora Shen, we have Ezreal Noxus decks, so like Ezreal Draven, Ezreal Swain that play pretty similar. There's the Twisted Fate Swain decks. There's Twisted Fate Go Hard. There's Ashe mid-range. There is Deep mid-range. There is Tahm Kench Soraka. There is a Lee one-trick deck, which is not really OTK, not one-trick, yeah.
Which very infrequently kills you in one turn. But it does feel like kind of like a combo.
I mean, it's more of a combo deck than a mid-range deck, I'd say.
I just didn't really. There aren't that many combo decks, so I kind of put them.
I would put it in the mid-range.
So with and then there's Vimer, which is Vi and Heimerdinger, which those are both Piltover's on champions, and they can be played with anything from like Shadow Isles to.
I've seen some Targon lists.
I think I would consider Vimer a Targon deck, and then the other decks that I've seen play like there's like some Vi Shadow Isles decks that I was getting crushed with when I was playing Pirates.
Yeah,
and then for like the control more heavy late game decks, there's stuff like I like to call it Karma KDA, but it's Karma Go Hard, usually Karma Thresh for the champions. There's an Anivia control deck that plays Anivia and Shadow Isles, but Anivia is the only champion and looks to put multiple Anivias into play with stuff like the Rekindler. Feel the Rush ramp decks, which are playing less things that actually accelerate your mana and more of like a lots of control tools game. Ezreal Go Hard, which uses Ezreal's the only champion, so Ezreal Shadow Isles, and usually Karina.
Usually plays Karina
Varaza, which is a Piltover's on like 9 mana champion that does a bunch of damage to their board. And then Invoke Control, which are like this subset of like Aurelion Soul, Diana,
Aurelion Soul, Leona,
and then there's some Diana Leona and some.
I've even
various.
seen some Diana Nocturne.
Yeah.
Wow.
But those are like aggro decks usually, but sometimes.
Oh no, it was an Invoke Control deck.
Oh, interesting.
Diana Nocturne. It was really cool.
All right, so that's kind of meta. There's a ton of viable decks. The thing about this game right now is that so many of these decks they're like against this wide of a field, they have maybe slightly better than a 50% aggregate win rate because there are few matchups that are hugely swingy, but there's some good amount of 60-40s, and you have a bunch of like 50-50s, 55-45s.
Yeah.
And so the edges that you're gaining are not huge. It's not like you find this deck currently, at least no one has, that is just so good against the field. Although that did happen for a little bit with this TF Go Hard deck that kind of just exploded.
The thing about the decks that are so good against the field is that they last for like literally 6 hours. Like they'll like bang, new hotness, sweet deck is here, it crushes everything. Yeah. That deck is going to be unknown for like 6 hours, and then everyone's going to be
I saw
playing
it on a Reddit post, played it a little bit. I was like, this deck is kind of janky. And then like a day later, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the nature of an online card game. Like when the community finds a deck and suddenly everyone's like, wait, this deck is actually good. Suddenly
And
everyone gets
not
to play
shill
it.
too much, but because it's free to play, you can just switch decks like all the time.
Yeah, it really
It's
does.
really easy to just like build the new hot deck or whatever, because like everybody has so many cards. And on top of that, like the meta moves so fast in this
Yeah.
game. I've said before that, but like I feel like I need a like AM deck and then like break for lunch, and then I need a new deck after lunch.
Yeah,
for like
just
for
based
like
on, like, what
laddering,
kind
just
of
based on
decks are
how
showing
fast
up.
the meta
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah, which I actually love
That's
personally.
awesome.
Yeah,
So
it's
awesome.
like there's no such thing as too healthy a meta game.
And it's really rewarding to grind and figure out what the last couple slots are. And I don't know, personally, I'm really like chomping at the bit right now. Like I'm trying to consume a lot of content, playing a ton of ranked, and really trying to like hone up my game in hopes of qualifying for the seasonal tournament. I have 2 Prime Glories, would have had 3 if not for an unfortunate technical malfunction of my phone dying while I was kind of in the middle of nowhere. And also grinding up that ladder. All of us are easily in range of that top 700. Other people in our kind of like I would consider testing group are already in qualified currently and hoping not to drop out and continuing to play, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I kind of want to just take kind of a closer look at a lot of these decks. That
yeah.
we've seen
Talk
in the
about decks
meta.
that we've been playing, maybe.
Talk about some stuff
Yeah.
that we've been playing. So you want to just start at the top, start with some of the aggro decks.
Yeah.
I know Hugh's been playing a lot of pirates.
Yeah, no, I've
kind of give some people some
Pirates
knowledge.
Pirates has been pretty much so. I started with scouts, like in the earlier part of the ladder, and then we hit like an update. Lee Sin got nerfed because I played that a bunch, and then
That
I
deck's
started.
so fun.
Yeah,
It sounds like so long ago, but this
I
was
know.
like last week.
It's like a week and a half ago or something like that.
Scouts just wasn't a deck. until,
Another
like, 2
part about
weeks
the
ago.
meta moving fast is that every 2 weeks ish, or sometimes 4 weeks, there's balance changes that are slightly adjusting the playability of the decks, taking decks down a little bit from dominance, which changes the kind of meta you're attacking, mostly like ramp being nerfed really recently.
Yep.
And I do want to point out it's like kind of the Wild West out there with how many decks, but like don't worry, if you were playing Fiora Shen 2 weeks ago, like the list is very similar. Like you can get back on, you can keep playing, like you can keep up and be trying to like finesse your deck to get all of these little edges when it's changing all the time. But also new cards aren't released that often. Well, they're released relatively often, but like your Fiora Shen deck from beta is like pretty similar to the Fiora Shen deck now. So like you don't have to worry too much about jumping back into it. Like
Your
you should
deck
just
isn't
go
going
for
to
it.
go good to terrible. Like that's not a thing that's really going to happen.
So anyway,
yeah,
hit me with some pirates.
yeah. Basically, that's just what I've been playing on ladder the most recently. I just like, God, I've played like what 50 games in the last like 48 hours, and the deck
Games are so quick.
games are super fast if you're playing an aggro deck. Like I've had games last as little as like 2 minutes. Like my opponent just scoops on like turn 3.
Yeah, sometimes they just die.
One drop, concede.
And then into like 3-drop Iron Ballista or MF, and you just swing for like 12 on turn 3, and they're just like, oh well, I'm at 3 now. So basically, the thing I love about Pirates is that you're never really out of the game. The deck has so much reach. Like you'll get
What do you mean by reach?
burn to their Nexus, just straight direct damage with spells to their Nexus. It plays 3 Decimate, plays 3 Noxian Fervor, plays 3 Zap Sprayfin,
Which only find the Noxian Fervor.
exactly. Noxian Fervor is the only 3 or less cost spell in the deck, so Zap Sprayfin will always find that card, which is very important to know if you don't already know that and you've come against the deck on ladder. A Zap will
Zap
draw that
Spraven
card.
Draws.
So basically, like if you're playing against a deck and you're like, okay, I've stabilized at like 9. I have a board, they have a board, but I can block all their creatures. You haven't really stabilized. Like when you're
Captain
playing
Farron too.
Yes, Captain
The
Farron's
thing
huge.
about pirates is that you always have to race it.
Yeah,
no
you
matter
do.
what deck you're playing, you have to race it because they will kill you eventually, unless you're playing like Karma Control or Anivia Control.
Yeah,
that,
the decks that heal
but,
up
like,
to 20.
Those decks can really heal that, but like for the most part, like even the Anivia decks, like you need
You
to
just have to
race it
attack. You
because,
need- you need to win the game.
deal 20 damage
Yeah.
before they draw their third.
Yeah,
Decimate
because
and kill you.
there's I mean well, we play 2 Captain Farrons. Like we have like 12 copies of Decimate. in
And
the deck.
also,
You're just
Crack
gonna
Shark
die.
Corsair, Legion Saboteur, Legion Grenadier, and MF all do damage even if they get killed, if they just get to attack. So,
Imperial Demolitionist does 2 damage
you
to
could,
your
have a,
face.
you could have a full board of 10 10s, and they could attack you with 3 creatures, still hit you for 3, and then finish you off with some
I have
burn.
managed many times against many mid-range decks to just be like,
Oh, and Flip Gangplank also.
Right,
does that.
exactly.
Chump attack and then
Sorry,
just-
what were you saying?
yeah, a lot of the time my opponent will just have like a massively superior board to me. I'll just be like, well, I'm never going to kill them by swinging with my creatures. I need to prioritize shooting their face with straight damage.
Yeah, this aggro deck does a lot of chumping. a lot
of chump blocking.
a lot of
5/5s
buy
with
time
2/2s.
to try
Yep.
and find your decimates.
Yep, exactly. And
So, yeah.
yeah, it just has you never feel like you're out of the game. That's the best
I
part.
really want to talk about
Jack the Winner is a big part too.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really want to talk about the Mistwraith deck, the Elise Callista with Pale
Which
Cascade.
is one of the deck's worst matchups, actually. In my
Pirates.
experience, Pirates. Yeah,
Yeah.
Pirates has struggles a lot.
A lot
Of
of 2/2s.
You
That's
just,
fearsome.
you just kind
Fearsome.
of don't block, and the fearsome deck. So this is a good point. So the fearsome deck is playing Elise Callista, and basically it's trying to do the Mistwraith thing. So it's got the full 3 copies of Mistwraith, the full 3 copies of Risenus, the full 3 copies of Wraithcaller, and then some like Stalking Shadows and stuff like that to try and find them. The deck is playing. It's basically just a lean Shadow Isles.
Seen a good amount of
aggro deck.
10-2 Mistwraiths. Yeah.
It's basically a lean Shadow Isles aggro deck. It really utilizes the mechanic Fearsome.
Yeah. Creatures are hard to block.
Creatures are really hard to block, especially out of the other aggressive decks that just tend to play more smaller
lot of
creatures.
2-power creatures.
Yeah, and sometimes the people just can't block. Like if you can just attack for like 15 or 16 with Mistwraiths, and your opponent can have like a full board, especially if they're playing like various TF decks. Those are really susceptible to it, and they just can't block anything.
Or they
like-
can block 2 of them, but you have 4-power Mistwraiths coming in
and
or
then they
whatever.
just die. It's pretty good right now. I think it's really well positioned. I really like the Pale Cascade.
The deck has a lot of value too, because like we were talking about Glimpse Beyond, but also Stalking Shadows,
goes
creating 2
so
copies of a
long.
unit. Keeping your hand full, and also doubling up. There's a lot of units in the deck that are really powerful if you get multiples at a time. For example, Frenzied Skitterer making their 3-power units now unable to block your Searsoms because it's giving them -1, -0. Even better at getting in multiple Doom Beasts to close out a game or stabilize, and
You win a lot
very
of
good
games
against
with Stalking
aggro.
Shadow for Doom
Yeah,
Beast.
multiple Wraith Callers. There's just
Wraithcaller's insane off Stalking Shadow.
even
You get to
just
keep
like
the Mistwraith.
even just getting a Mistwraith, like
yeah, exactly.
And then even just getting a Mistwraith, and you play a 6-power Mistwraith for 2 mana. It pumps all your other Mistwraiths, so it's like essentially like 9 power for 2 mana. Who cares if it has Ephemeral?
Yeah.
Like
it doesn't
it's
matter.
still
They're
attacking.
dying on that
they
turn.
They
Who
probably
cares?
have to block it. Like even if they don't have to block it, they're still taking a huge chunk. And I've been really happy with the deck. I played pretty much only that deck all yesterday. I climbed a couple ranks in mid plat.
yeah.
So not the highest rank or anything.
You
but-
played too much limited to have started this season with a really high rank.
Yeah. I started playing
Basically only Expedition
I
for like
still to this day do my 3 expeditions per week because I really like
Really?
Expedition.
Oh my god, that's so much. I stopped playing Expedition like
yeah, it's a really good way
long time
to
ago.
get cards, but
I haven't
but
done
less
it
for sure.
this week yet because
Yeah.
I like really need to be grinding constructed. But last week I played my 3
Yeah, we're getting down to
expeditions.
the wire here.
Yeah. So
I
the,
think that something to note about all the good aggro decks right now is this is true of Discard, Fearsome, and Pirates.
yeah,
they
that's
just
the last one we should talk about is discard.
yeah,
So
exactly.
that's just
They
gonna
just all have a lot of ways to close out the game, even when your opponents stabilize at like 7 or 8 health. Like
Yeah,
they
the
have a
deck
lot
plays
of direct damage. Like
the
Doom Beast is
Harrowing.
huge.
It
Harrowing.
played the Harrowing in some number. I've heard that people are subbing that out for Atrocity. I actually haven't tried that yet. But it sounds better than the Harrowing to me. But regardless, you need to know that you are in danger of dying.
Yeah,
Even with
so-
a full board at 9 or whatever, because if they cast the Harrowing, they're going to bring back a bunch of stuff with Fearsome.
Yeah, it's like
Can't block the
Wraithcaller, get a
Fearsome
permanent
things,
Mistwraith. Wraithcaller, get a permanent
Uh-oh.
Wraith. Bring back Frenzy Sitter, and they're like, I can't. None of my creatures can block, and
I've
they
played-
have 10-tower Mistwraiths.
I've played end of turn, or I've played Harrowing on my opponent's turn when they have the attack token before, just because I know it's bringing back a bunch of Wraithcallers that are going to give me permanent Mistwraiths.
and then you can block with the 4/3s.
And then I blocked with the 4/3s or whatever. And it's actually really good. I've even done it after my opponent has attacked on
Yeah.
their turn. Like they played their thing, we're like pass. I'm like Harrowing, make 3 Mistwraiths. Like untap, just like attack with all my Mist Wraiths. And
Risen Mist, get attack
yeah,
with 4,
exactly.
yeah.
Risen Mist, by the way, is an absurd card.
Yeah, it's like the only true for Magic players, it's the only true haste creature in the game because all units can attack the turn you play them, but it's burst, so it puts the unit into play, and then
you
you
get to
still
attack
have priority, and you can attack.
It's like 4 mana. Sometimes it makes like
five,
8
too.
power.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's like 8. Like if you have like 2 Mist Wraiths in play, like it is 8 power that your opponent cannot respond to, and it's attacking them with Fearsome. It's insane.
Yeah, so you get a Spellman on turn 1, on turn 2 play a Mist Wraith, and on turn 3 with the attack token play Risen Mists, and that's just 6 with Fearsome.
Yeah,
on
it's
turn
just
3.
so much. Yeah.
And then when you play a Wraithcaller the next turn, it's more and more power. So the next thing I want to talk about is discard aggro. I'll more quick and dirty on this deck. A lot of players use this, me included, to climb out of the lower ranks. It's very good at it's so
really-
fast.
you
it has
really win the
absurd
games.
starts with a bunch of creatures.
It's the
think-
lowest to the ground, most explosive. It makes.
I think this deck has the best draws in the game.
Yeah.
I think that this deck's nut draws are unparalleled.
It also has
I agree
insane
with
late
that.
game with Jinx too. So
Yeah, if Jinx is alive, you're probably not winning the game. And if she's alive and flipped, I should say.
yeah, you are probably winning the game if you have her in play.
Yeah, or you'll lose to it.
That's what I meant when I said. Yeah.
So Draven and Jinx, ways to discard things like Vision, pumping your units, going wide with Arena Battlecaster and House Spider and Jury Rigs to attack with a bunch of 3/1s very early in the game.
It's shocking how often you are attacking for 7 on turn 2. with
Yeah, I had this really disgusting game where I played House Spider. I played House Spider into Draven, banking a Spellman on turn 1, and then on my attack turn on turn 3 with Draven, I attacked. He blocked a 5 power thing on my Draven, and I played Rummage, discarded 2 visions, drew another vision, discarded that to the axe, and just dealt my opponent 10 damage.
Yeah, that's disgusting.
That's
yeah.
gross.
I also, it's real quick aside. I think that Vision is probably the best card in the deck, and you should play around it.
And don't mulligan it if you're playing it.
And don't mulligan it.
Yeah.
I keep that card in almost every matchup, regardless of whether or not I have a way to discard it in my opener.
So for our theme for this episode, talking about interaction, the most important thing to know about these aggro decks, the Pirate aggro deck's only fast spell is Noxian Fervor. They do not have they do not play combat tricks, because those are cheap and they want to be able to always find Noxian Fervor with Zap Sprayfin. So that's the reach that you're playing around. Try to be able to kill their unit in response. Try to not make blocks that are bad against it. For example, tapping low to Grasp of the Undying one of their creatures, and then when you get to Noxian Fervor their face, which cancels out the life gain from the Grasp of the Undying,
like a 6
and hits them
point
for
swing,
3.
yeah.
Very good.
The Mistwraith deck, the Fearsome deck,
Is now playing Atrocity, but before that didn't have any fast spells.
only Pale Cascade, but you
Pale
do
Cascade
need
and
to play around it.
the Ephemeral
Doom
Strength
of
of
the
the Isles. Mark of the
Mark
Isles.
of the
Doom
Isles
Beast
as
is its other reach.
burn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In general, you just you just need to chump block a lot in this game. I think,
Life total's so
especially
important.
against the aggro decks. But we just got over the fact that all of these decks can kill you from 12.
Yeah.
Pirates can kill you from 12. Discard aggro can just kill you from 12. Mistwraiths can just kill you from 12. Even higher technically, but the higher life total is, the less likely it is to happen, right? If you're at 2 against a Mistwraith aggro deck, you're just going to die to Doom Beast. If you're at 4, you're probably going to die to Stalking Shadows into Doom Beast. If you're at
Or 2 Stygian onlookers that are hard to block.
If you're at 15, you're probably all right, even through the harrowing. So don't feel bad about just tossing away a blocker if
Random
you need to save
2/2
your life
units,
total. Yeah, you really just want to make sure you have a high life total. The discard aggro deck is the worst at getting there,
Well, but it also has Get Excited and Jinx Rockets.
and it's not bad either.
And Elusive Daring Poros.
Yep,
So
exactly. Yeah.
it actually has really powerful burst turns even late in the game where it's Get Excited, discard my last card, 3 to the face, get a Jinx Rocket, 4 to the face, attack with some Daring Poros.
It's mostly the Jinx Rocket is just such a huge
Yeah.
If
source
that
of
deck
damage.
can't flip Jinx, it doesn't have a late game.
Yeah,
And even when I
exactly.
say late game, I really mean the turn 6.
Yeah.
Or
just because of
7.
how low to the ground and how
Yeah.
fast discard is meant
Because
to be.
the late game is not there. You will lose if you get to turn 10 with that deck probably, but you have a reasonable mid game backup plan.
Yeah. So what is the best thing to be doing against all these decks? Mostly casting the card Withering Wail. Really good against discard aggro.
Yeah.
All kinds of healings, very, very good against pirates, because if you think about it, if you're casting a spell that kills one of their units and gains you 3 life, that's both killing that unit, and their Decimate, that is 5 mana and 4 to the face, is also getting mostly canceled out.
Yep.
all of these things are worse about Mistwraiths, which is against Mistwraiths, which is why it was so well positioned for so long.
Yep.
But that
So
doesn't
long,
have
it's
a
like
lot
day and
of.
a half.
Yeah,
It's probably still good right now.
yeah, it is
As a
definitely
matter
still
of
good right
fact,
now.
It's definitely still good right now.
Is one of the decks that I would recommend climbing with. It has a pretty high skill floor, but also pretty low, or pretty low skill floor, but also pretty high ceiling. I think that's all the time we're going to devote to aggro decks.
I agree.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
So now we're getting into mid-range decks. I tried to, after jumping around on decks a lot, I decided to settle on Fiora Shen. I'm not going to boast about my win rate here because it's not boastable, but it is positive. And, I'm climbing with Fiora Shen. It's taken me many games to learn this deck. This deck
really
is
hard.
very hard. There's a lot of things to know about win. Knowing your win conditions is such a huge thing with this deck. I think that I could do a whole podcast episode on this deck. Knowing your win condition, knowing whether you're a beatdown deck in the matchup and want to go like 2-drop into 3-drop attack for 6, or your plan is to flip Fiora, or you should abandon the Fiora plan and kill them with Screeching Dragons. The thing about all of these plans is that Shen is really good in all of them. I actually think Shen is the better of the two champions in the deck, perhaps controversially, though Fiora does technically win you more games because she's a win condition.
Yeah, she's.
But he's such an incredible support card with any challenger unit. I beat a Mistwraiths decks because Shen blocks 2 Mistwraiths and also gives your Fleet Feather Tracker barrier, and which continues to eat Mistwraiths.
Yep.
I would like to propose that we change this podcast to a Screeching Dragon Stand podcast.
Oh god, that card is so
I love
good.
Screeching Dragon. It's the best. It's so good.
Yeah.
It's just the best.
If anyone needs a summoner name, Screeching Dragon is a pretty good one. My personal favorite is Lounging Lizard. I couldn't get through 2 episodes of this podcast without mentioning that. So there's a ton to say about that deck. Mostly deny, single combat, concerted strike, tons of tricks, tons of barriers, sharp sight. The deck is just packed full of tricks, and it uses spell mana very well. And it also means that you need to be setting up turns when you're playing that deck when you have banked spell mana where you can protect your Fiora, protect your Shen.
I think that that deck is really interesting to play against as well as to play, because a lot of decks like Fiora Shen or decks that just have a lot of interaction that they can hold up and make you make the first move on are usually really hard to play against, but they don't always have hard to play as well. So a lot of control decks in this game, I think, fall into the hard to play against, but aren't necessarily hard to play
because you have so many fast spells that you can like really mess up and then still let them open attack with a good board, and then like
and a lot of the time, like your opponent has to decide what they can and can't play around, and then you either just have it or not. And like that, your opponent made the important decision of whether or not they play around it or not, and then you just either punish or do not appropriately. With the Fiora Shen deck, it feels like your opponent has to decide what they're playing around, and you then, in response, have to decide which answer you are going to use to deal with their proposed plan, essentially. So, like, it's both a back and forth of, I'm going to play this card. What's your answer? Like, I have 3 answers. I'm going to play this one for this reason. It's like, okay, well, I have 2 more of these. And if you don't line your things up correctly, you'll oftentimes lose because of that.
And if you do, you'll win. And something that's important to know about the Fiora deck is sometimes you really just have to abandon protecting the Fiora because your protection spells like Riposte and Deny cost so much mana. I was watching a game of this European Masters tournament where he had 8 mana and his opponent cast Go Hard on their Fiora, and that was at 1 toughness, and they just like let it resolve because I'm not trading 1 mana for 4 mana here and then getting blown out by another one and then having to trade 1 mana for 4 mana again and then not having any cards in my hand.
I think the thing about Fiora Shen, I think, really exemplifies this, but I think it's true entirely in the game as well, is you really need to make sure that you aren't picking fights that you can't win.
Yeah.
I've said that phrase a lot, especially when watching and playing the Fiora Shen deck, is like, can we really do this? I'm not sure we can win this fight. And as I started saying that more and more, and then like I started playing other decks, and then I started realizing more and more that like, wait a second, like maybe like I also don't think I can win this fight here. So it's like picking your timing is really important, which I think is a huge part of the like pass mechanic.
Yeah.
But I think like make sure that you're trying to line up your responses appropriately. If you can't win the fight, don't fight it. Yeah. Basically.
You should pass more than you think that you should pass.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Like I should just pass here in our group Discord calls when we're playing games is usually
God,
just pass here. Oh, I didn't think about that. You're right.
Yeah,
It happens all the
exactly.
time.
Yeah, it'd be a good drinking game.
And also, like when you have the ability to really press the attack into your opponent, you really need to put pressure on them. Like pressure their spell mana in that matchup. Like
Yeah.
in order to beat the Fiora Shen deck, because if you can make them use a riposte, suddenly you really want to make them use another spell.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important to try and line your threats up such that you're always trading up in mana, because the thing about that deck is sometimes it feels completely unbeatable.
Yeah, because you're like, they
just have
they
everything.
Sharp Sight, they have all the barriers, they have Shen, like
Usually
they have
your
a single
answers-
combat to win the game. Yeah.
Usually your answers actually cost less than their responses. So
Depending,
like Noxian
like-
Fervor, or like Death's Hand if it has a damage on it, or like a TF card, or something
or
like that
things
with
to
a
break
barrel.
barriers like Vile Feast and Unspeakable Horror.
Exactly.
The deck is really good if you're trying to kill Fiora with Vengeance.
Exactly.
And
The
you get to
problem
die
is
it.
you're on a timer to do so.
Yeah.
Right. So while the Fiora deck is frequently losing the actual mana war, they only need to hold on for a few turns usually.
for sure.
So like they can afford to lose the mana war because they kill you at the end of it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Okay. So
But anyway, that's kind of
now
all I have to
think
say
it's
about
probably
that.
time to move on. I think there are kind of a couple other classes of deck I want to talk about. One of them is these like damaged base is what I'm going to call them decks. So they're based on using damaging spells on your units, and they do this to either flip Swain, Ezreal, both, or TF, or
Yeah, they
use
usually are
TF
accompanied by
and
TF.
kegs. So like these are the Ezreal Draven, which plays a little different than Ezreal Swain, Swain TF. I've even seen Ezreal TF.
Just
a
straight
combination
Ezreal.
of like all of the damage across kegs. It's like, do you want kegs from Bilgewater to have really explosive cards? Get it? The kegs explode.
Wow. Okay.
Noxious. A lot of them play Noxus for their very good removal spells from there, and
A bit of Shadow Isles as well. If
yeah.
you just feel like you need some vengeances.
yeah. So those kind of decks, they play a lot of damage-based removal. They are generally good against the lower to ground aggro decks, though they can struggle against Mist Wraiths going like a little bigger. But they're generally good against the aggro decks. Can struggle against the decks that go bigger than them, like Karma Go Hard and like Ezreal Go Hard. A lot of Go Hard decks in this category.
I think
like
Go
Invoke
Hard is
Control,
just Go Hard
Anivia.
in and of itself is just an archetype.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
just-
Probably.
and that's the other one. So I think damage-based control decks, I think of those as separate than the Go Hard decks, and in some they overlap because there's Go Hard TF and there's Go Hard Ezreal.
Yep.
And all of these things are exploiting kegs to add damages to things like Go Hard or other damage spells, or kegs are actually used a lot in the TF Go Hard deck, which is the kind of marquee deck. If there was a picture of the best decks, I think that we're looking at, like, in my opinion, on ladder, I'm seeing a lot of Mist Wraiths. I'm seeing a lot of this TF Go Hard deck. I'm seeing not a lot of Pirates, but I think it's very good, and a lot of Fiora Shen. So then there's this kind of smorgasbord of like Ash mid-range deep, Tom Raka, Vimer, Leo TK, which I don't see as much.
Those are all very different decks
Yeah.
for the most part.
And they
I
all
don't-
feel like tier 2, I think.
They're
me.
so yeah, they're in a place where I think those are not the best ladder decks to be grinding. One, because their games take a little longer on average.
And they have some really polarized matchups. Like Tom
Exactly.
Raka cannot beat Fearstones because the deck literally does not have a 3-power unit in it.
Yeah, unless you're buffing your Star Shaper. What's it called?
Star Shepherd.
Shepherd.
Star
counts,
Shepherd.
I guess. And then
But
flipping your Tom Kench counts. And then are there?
I got annihilated
Oh, sorry.
by-
It has the Challenger. It has the Challenger unit.
Okay, Boxtopus. Yes.
I got annihilated by Tom Rocco when I was playing Mistrace like 3 games in a row.
What are you doing, man? The matchup's so easy.
He played all 3 shakedowns and a Soraka, and he just kept killing my stuff. Like,
I guess
I
you get all
could
your-
not stick a unit. I would play a unit, and he would play like Boxtopus shakedown.
That's another thing. Is all
eat
of
your
these
thing, eat your thing, eat
Yeah.
your thing. And I'd be like, well,
and then Tom Kench,
sucks.
eat your thing, eat your thing,
well,
eat your thing.
By the time they played Tom Kench, I packed it up. But you
Yeah,
know,
packed your
like,
bags.
Yeah, I packed my bags, and I went to
That
the next
sounds
game.
like an anomaly to me. That sounds like.
Oh, I agree. I
yeah.
thought the matchup
But
was
you-
pretty good,
you
but I
can
thought it was
also build
hilarious.
these
That
decks.
I just like got annihilated by Tom Rocco 3 games in a row, and those were like the first 3 games I played with the deck, or at least a few of the first ones. I almost just deleted it on the spot.
yeah.
I was almost done.
Another thing that like playing all those shakedowns or whatever in Tom Raka makes you a lot better against aggro decks, but a lot worse against like Anivia control, which you might have been doing fine against before then. So there's some trade-offs here. I don't want to talk too much about that smorgasbord of decks. I want to move on to control, talking about mostly these are
I think
these
just real
Shadow
quick.
Isles, sometimes Shadow Isles.
Yeah,
Okay,
just real
good.
quick before we go to that, I just think the takeaway here is that there's those 5 or 6 decks that we mentioned, and they just aren't great for ladder. They have very
They're totally reasonable though. If you want to play them, if you want to learn
Yes.
them,
Yeah,
do
if
it.
they're your thing,
Yes,
play them.
absolutely. Yeah. They just take a little while, and sometimes it feels more
I
like
think they're just a little bit
Also
innately
good in a
less powerful.
tournament lineup. Would expect to see these
Exactly.
in tournaments.
That's the main
Yeah.
thing I wanted to get at. They're very good in tournament.
Because they do specific things. Like Deep goes so big, like Maokai, Nautilus, and cheap, huge creatures.
Yep.
So good against other mid-range
Leo
decks.
TK eats control decks
Yeah.
so well.
Yeah, because of all those that trifecta I was talking about of Targon burst spells. It just has so much interaction.
And it scoops really hard to aggro because they play like 5 creatures.
Hey man, Mountain Goat does work.
Mountain Goat and what's it called? Eye of the Dragon.
Eye of the Dragon is
Mountain
one of the
Goat
best cards
is
against
my
that.
favorite card in that deck. I've killed so many
Mountain
people
Goat
with 12
is
power Mountain
really
Goats.
good in that
Oh, I
deck,
wanted to talk about
actually.
gems when we talked about Targon, but that's another thing to know if your opponent's making gems, which some of these decks do. As far as like they can't cast them in response to spells, so you want to put your damage spells on the stack before giving them a chance to play.
Yeah, it's
Gems.
basically the same
Yeah,
deal.
exactly.
Yeah,
And these decks have a ton of interaction. Like it's worth looking through like meta decks and stuff to know. There's a ton of pings in the Shadow Isles decks because of Go Hard. So 1 health units are almost worse than when Make It Rain was dominating the meta. Not because they're still trading for a card now instead of getting absolutely like 3 for 1 against a Make It Rain.
Yeah.
They're a little better and they're definitely still playable, but it does make things like Ranger's Resolve really good in Demacia decks. So
Anyway.
TF Gohard is one of the marquee decks, and then a lot of these control decks are almost all Shadow Isles, and then the Karma deck, the Ezreal deck, also Gohard decks, and they're all doing it in a different way. Karma's really good when she's flipped, and you put a Gohard on the stack, it doubles it, and it can flip to your pack your bags if you've cast enough.
I think that the Karma deck has the best late game in the game. I think that deck
you
does
say that,
not lose when it has
That or Anivia is where I'm at.
I think it's better than Anivia.
And that's that's just
I have lost with Karma to Deep. I think Deep might be Maokai flipping, putting you on such a clock, and then you are never going to deck because you keep shuffling cards in with Gohards, but then your deck is all Gohards. Drawing 1 Gohard a turn is not going to do it against 7/7s.
that has been true. It's also the opposite has been true for me. It's either like obviously win or you lose, but like it's sometimes that's exactly what you need, and sometimes go
I found
hard
that
is
if you have,
just what you want, and sometimes it's just absolutely the worst thing.
I found that if you have like cards in your hand when the Maokai flips, you're usually fine.
Yeah.
Because if you have like a deep meditation in your hand, like you're gonna win for sure, probably.
Okay.
If you have like Karma and Gohards in your deck. But sometimes you're just gonna get to a point where you're drawing 1 card a turn.
So
and
this
your
deck-
opponent's attacking with 13 power creatures with Tough and Fearsome or whatever, and eventually you're gonna have to jump and lose. But I have won quite a few games where my opponent obliterates my deck, and then I just like constantly am drawing cards and Goharding.
Doubling Gohards with a Karma, and then
Or
dealing 5 to
something.
their face.
One of the sweetest games I've ever played was against the Maokai deck, where I was playing the TF Gohard deck.
Yeah.
And my opponent obliterated my deck, but I had Twisted Fate, a second Twisted Fate. So I had a Twisted Fate pick a card, and then my deck was all Gohards. And so every turn, and my Twisted Fate was flipped. So every turn, my play was like draw a card, draw 3 cards.
Tells a pick a card, draw a card for turn.
Yeah. Like, play my Twisted Fate thing, like, go hard. And then I would like chump with my TF, which would draw me another TF or whatever. If I had to chump with my TF, I'd draw more TFs and then play more TFs and then shuffle your TFs back in.
Yeah.
And your TFs just keep getting shuffled in.
Yeah.
And like,
just an absurd gameplay loop. I
you
think
just go.
basically most of these control decks are some combination of Go Hard or Shadow Isles. Like frequent overlap.
The one that has been picking up popularity too, but I have honestly yet to be impressed with, is this Invoke control deck. You lose games to it because sometimes they like play an Aurelion Soul, or sometimes they play these really big Invoke units that you can't kill, but I think my win rate against it is much better than against Shadow Isles decks.
I agree.
I'm gonna try it today. Is what I've told myself. I've heard good things from multiple
You
people.
couldn't have tried it before the podcast.
Well, no, I didn't have time. I was playing Mist Wraith decks. Okay. But I have played against it quite a few times. What I can say is that Star Shaping is not as good of an aggro plan as people think it is.
Anti-aggro plan.
And maybe we need to address the fact that all of our creatures can't block Mist Wraiths.
Yeah.
But outside of that, yeah, it seems pretty powerful. I've seen a lot of different versions of the deck. Aurelion Sol Leona seems to be the most popular one, I think. Yeah. I've even seen versions playing like Diana Nocturne.
Yeah, she's like good early game. Like you can use her to challenge a Mist Wraith or whatever.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because like it's a Diana Nocturne deck, but it was a control deck.
Yeah,
it was playing all the Invoke stuff, and it was not an aggressive deck at all. It was basically using Diana and Nocturne as just efficient creature removal spells. And
that
it was
eventually win the game, which is good.
That eventually win the game, but really it was trying to win the game with its Invoke cards, and it was just playing Diana as a good 2-mana card and Nocturne as a good 4-mana card.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. I don't know. A lot of the control decks are playing a lot of creatures, so the removal is never dead, which is a big thing. And I think one of the funniest interactions I've seen in this game was maybe it was yesterday or 2 days ago. Noble, you wanted to put Vengeance in what was it, the Mist Wraith deck?
Yeah,
the aggressive
I
Mist Wraith
just want to kill him. I just wanted to kill a creature. But so Atrocity's way better.
This is fascinating to me, and I've gone back and thought about this because you wanted to put 7-mana Murder in your aggro deck to deal with control. That's weird, right?
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah.
That's what you decided your aggro deck needed to beat these control decks with all these creatures you couldn't beat.
Yeah.
Isn't that I thought that was super interesting because I was thinking about that. I was like, Atrocity is clearly way better.
I think it was directly after losing to Radiant Guardian is when I wanted to put a Vengeance in my deck.
It's like sometimes like all these control decks are playing a bunch of creatures. Your removal spells are good, and it's like, man, you know what my aggro deck needs? 7-mana Murder.
Yeah.
So I can deal with this unbeatable flipped Gangplank or whatever.
Exactly. That one creature that you just can't get through as the aggro deck, and you just need to get around that one creature.
Yeah. Anyway, that was a food for thought thing that I thought was really interesting.
And it turns out Atrocity is better. It's 1 mana cheaper. It also kills your opponent. It also stops their Fiora from killing a unit to like flip. It's really good against removal. Atrocity is
so much.
Atrocity is way better.
It is way better getting blown out, but it's better.
I think it's pretty fun that was like a legit thought that you had.
Oh, for sure.
Anyway, I think that's pretty much everything we have for today. Are there any closing points anyone wants to make?
I guess where we should end up is the best aggro decks, like they just really want to go wide. They have a lot of damage straight to your face. You can't stabilize at a low life total. You'll probably still lose.
They're also hard to play. They're not mindless. You need to think about when you're going to pass, when you're going to open attack, when you should play your 4/3 trample before attacking with your 3/3.
Honestly, I think in general, aggro decks in this game are harder than control decks.
Very much agree.
Control decks in this game are usually some combination of Shadow Isles or Go Hard right now.
Go Hard is Shadow Isles.
No, I know, but like some decks plan is Go Hard, some decks plan involves Shadow Isles, just
like Ruination.
Exactly, the good spells, or Go Hard. Obviously, there's overlap because they're in the same region. And then mid range is a little weird to talk about, but the recap I think there is that there's such a wide range of middling decks that have wildly different game plans. Leo TK is very different from Ash Midrange, which is very different from Tom Raka. And there's just a lot of stuff like that in the middle of these aggro decks and these control decks. So there's just something for everyone here.
Cool. One of the huge things with what deck you want to be playing is if it lines up well against the kind of answer decks that people are playing. So like a bunch of 3 toughness creatures is very good when everyone's playing these Ezreal decks that I was talking about that are a pile of Mystic Strats
or a bunch of
Avalanches. Death's Hands, or Avalanches, right? But if everyone's playing, you can also go under that by playing a bunch of 1 toughness creatures, right? But if everyone's playing Withering Wails and Vile Feasts, you want
play
to play 2 toughness creatures. And trying to kind of stay ahead of the curve. In this game, damage does combine, right? Because damage is permanent.
Yeah.
So it'll kind of combine to do it, but you want to make them use more cards. Another thing is with these, like we're talking about, it's lining up answers to threats. It's making sure all of these decks have creatures, so, making good trades. There's a lot of fundamentals, a lot of thoughts about when to pass, and then really it's knowing what's in your opponent's deck. It's like having an idea of what they can and can't do based on their regions. They can't for example, they have very little counterplay. They're not Shadow Isle, so they don't have Runation. They're not Ionia, so they don't have Deny. So this Harrowing is going to put 6 units on the board that you're going to get to attack with. Outside of some, those are the cards that are played. There's also like Judgment and Singular Will, which I don't think I've seen either of them. I did get beaten by Judgment in Constructed recently, but
not super common.
You know, that's once in like hundreds of games.
Yeah, exactly. That's really not a common thing.
So knowing things like that, knowing to play around Mystic Shot, Pale Cascade, like that is how you take yourself to the next level besides playing a good deck. And since so many of these decks are so good and there are so many decks, the real edges that you can gain are knowing your role in the matchup, knowing how you beat specific cards, knowing when to play around things. And that comes with playing a lot, and I'm definitely still working on it.
Really comes with playing specific decks a lot too.
Yeah.
That you alluded to a little earlier.
Yeah, and when you're laddering, try and stay with the same deck. You'll just get better at that one deck. You'll know how to play it, and you'll climb better. Consistency is good.
Yeah, and notably, just like a real quick closing note on a deck that I do think is very good right now is this Anivia control deck. Dodges all of the things that we were just talking. Alex was just like, all of the control decks have removal spells, but removal spells are really bad against Anivia because the 2/4 is hard to kill with the damage-based removal spells, and then you also need to kill the egg, and then it's also bringing them back with Rekindlers and Missed Calls. So the deck is a Shadow Isles control deck that is looking to kind of circumvent all of this removal and stuff and just like kill you with Anivias, and then play all the other control tools. So you can also find decks like that. The TF Gohard deck is a really interesting of like a kind of best deck because it has a bunch of small units, it has a bunch of removal spells, it draws a lot of cards. So Mystic Shot's good against it. Card advantage is good against it. Big units are good against it. It's interesting.
It kills you weirdly fast, but it also has a really good late game. It's very bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think that pretty much wraps up this episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Next time, we're probably going to be going real deep into the seasonal championship.
Yep, it is this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, talking a lot about tournaments. Maybe we'll even hopefully publish an episode a little bit earlier so that we can talk about our testing and the decks that we're going to want to be registering. So maybe we'll shoot for a slightly earlier upload, but we'll have to see.
Oh yeah, likely an episode because the seasonal tournament takes place over 2 weeks. We'll likely have an episode about what we registered and what I'm talking about and what other people we know registered, and then we'll have an episode about a look back.
Results.
So yeah, stay tuned in for those.
Yeah, looking forward to those. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next week on Shape Select.